The wind had carried the scent of iron and rot through the hollows for days before anyone realized something was wrong. In the year 1866, the Appalachian Mountains stretched like a dark spine across the land, fog coiling between jagged ridges, hiding valleys so deep that sunlight barely touched the soil. It was in one of these hidden hollows, where Virginia brushed against Kentucky, that the Whitlock family had lived for generations. Their cabin stood alone, built by hands hardened by cold and stone, and by a father who believed the mountains themselves would shield his bloodline from the outside world. Samuel Whitlock, a man of 43, had known only these woods since childhood. His face was a map of weather and suffering, etched with lines carved by wind and grief alike. His wife Martha had died 16 years earlier, leaving him with twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel. The girls were identical, chestnut-haired with eyes like storm clouds, and Samuel's devotion to them was fierce, almost unnatural. Neighbors whispered of the family's obsession with bloodlines, the marriages within cousins, the closing of their family circle until it resembled a tangled vine rather than a branching tree. It was in March, when the snows had begun to recede but the streams still ran ice cold, that Rebecca and Rachel vanished. Samuel had ridden to the settlement of Harland to trade furs, a journey of a full day over perilous trails, only to return 2 days later to a cabin that seemed untouched, yet hollow. Their beds were made, the dishes stacked neatly, but the girls were gone. The air in the room smelled faintly of smoke and pine, as if the forest itself had inhaled them. Samuel searched for weeks, shouting their names, until his voice rasped raw. He questioned families miles away, eyes wild with desperation, only to be met with silence and the occasional wary glance that spoke of unspoken family histories. No one had seen the twins. The local folk whispered of the Whitlock legacy, the marriages between cousins, the stubborn preservation of a pure bloodline, the strange behaviors that had persisted for generations. But whispers do not bring back children. The months stretched into years, and the story of the missing twins became a cautionary murmur in the valleys. Samuel aged in solitude, talking to empty chairs, leaving places at the table for daughters who no longer existed, waiting each evening by the cabin door, as though the forest might cough them back into existence. In these woods, the echoes of his voice became a ghostly hymn, carrying through the misted ridges, a lonely sound that would eventually attract the attention of those who sought God's work in places the civilized world had long abandoned. Which city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The mountains watched in silence, the forest waited, and somewhere beyond the line of sight, in a cabin hidden by twisted roots and jagged stone, the first evidence of a darkness that would take 17 years to reveal had already begun to take shape. By the autumn of 1883, 17 years had passed since the March day the Whitlock twins vanished. The mountains had swallowed Samuel Whitlock's daughters as easily as they swallowed the fog, leaving only stories whispered between farmers and hunters, stories half-believed, stories that smelled faintly of pine smoke and sorrow. But in the backroads of Appalachia, where maps ended and memory alone guided travelers, a preacher named Josiah Green would stumble upon what no one else had ever found. Reverend Green had been traveling these mountains for over a decade, carrying scripture and hymns into hollows that had never heard the sound of a church bell. His boots pressed into soil thick with leaves, the air damp and cold, carrying the faint stench of decayed wood and distant livestock. He followed a trail that seemed to vanish into nothing, a path twisted and hidden by roots, moss and rock. And then, as if the forest had parted for his arrival, he saw it, a cabin. But it was crooked, leaning heavily to one side, with walls patched in bark and hides, its chimney spitting thin curling smoke. Outside, children played. 7 of them, of varying ages from perhaps 15 down to 2. Yet Reverend Green felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Their movements were awkward, disjointed, their eyes at odd angles, heads too large or too small, bodies bent or twisted. One boy's fingers were fused together, like mittens of flesh. Another girl moved with a lurching gait that seemed older than her age. Still, despite their deformities, they laughed, or something like it, calling to each other in tones that carried an echo of wildness. Then two women appeared, stepping from the cabin as silently as shadows. They were immediately familiar, though decades had passed. Rebecca and Rachel Whitlock, aged far beyond their 16 years, faces lined, bodies worn from labor and years of confinement. Their eyes were wide, cautious, but something in their gaze betrayed recognition, a glimmer of hope that someone had finally come. "Please," Rebecca said first, her voice rough, cracked by disuse. "Please help us." What Reverend Green would learn in the following hours would haunt him beyond comprehension. The twins had not fled of their own will. They had not been kidnapped by outsiders. No, they had been deliberately hidden in a second cabin, 4 miles distant from the main homestead, a place Samuel Whitlock himself had prepared. There, he had ensured they survived, and yet remained prisoners. The children playing outside were all theirs, products of the father they had never seen as anything other than their guardian, but who was also their grandfather. The air hung heavy with the smell of dirt and smoke, of sweat and fear. Reverend Green listened as Rebecca and Rachel described the methodical horror of their captivity, how Samuel visited regularly, bringing supplies, ensuring pregnancies, enforcing obedience with threats that required no physical touch. The isolation of the clearing, the cabin hidden from the world, was punishment enough. For 17 years, the Whitlock bloodline had been folded in upon itself, generation upon generation producing children marked by the consequences of extreme consanguinity. And yet, despite every violation, every atrocity, the twins had endured. They had survived, and in their survival, they had protected what little they could, the lives of the children born to a nightmare of their father's design. For children. Reverend Green saw that October morning were living testaments to isolation's cruel arithmetic. 7 souls born under the weight of a twisted bloodline, their bodies marked with deformities that whispered of generations folded too tightly upon themselves. The eldest, a girl perhaps 15, bore subtle clefts and misshapen limbs. Another boy, 10 years old, had fingers fused like the claws of some woodland creature, his movements awkward yet deliberate. Their eyes, grey and pale like storm clouds, carried something older than the years they had known, an understanding of fear, of hunger, of confinement, and of the unnatural geometry of their own existence. Rebecca and Rachel spoke slowly, cautiously, as if each word might fracture the fragile trust forming between them and the preacher. They told him how Samuel had taken them from their home, how he had led them to the hidden clearing, how he had made it clear that their lives were no longer their own. Survival was not enough. Obedience was required. Samuel's obsession with preserving the Whitlock bloodline had never wavered. He had stocked the cabin with enough provisions to sustain life, yet nothing beyond that. The girls' world had contracted into walls of bark and timber, the forest surrounding them both a protector and a jailer, each tree a silent witness to repeated pregnancies, each rock a sentinel over innocence stolen. Reverend Green saw how the twins had adapted, how they had carved meaning from the abyss. They had told stories to their children, sung songs their mother had taught them, nurtured what little normalcy could be forged in such circumstances. Yet there was no denial of the horror, no illusions that the children's existence was anything but the result of sustained violation. And still, in the quiet moments, Rebecca and Rachel revealed a strange, complicated tenderness. They loved these children, not as symbols of their father's cruelty, but as separate beings, as fragile sparks of humanity surviving in the shadows. The forest around the clearing held its breath as the preacher listened. Every branch, every fallen leaf seemed to mark the passage of time differently here. Sunlight fell in muted beams, catching dust motes that hung suspended like whispers of forgotten years. It was a place apart from history, yet history itself was pressed upon it. The Civil War just ended, the nation bleeding, mountains uncharted, and yet Samuel Whitlock had been building his own empire of control and decay, unseen by any authority, unchallenged by law, unconstrained by morality. Reverend Green's pastoral mind recoiled at what he was hearing, struggling to reconcile faith with the reality of human cruelty. He wrote furiously in his journal, each word a record of what should not exist, 7 children born of incest, raised in isolation, suffering deformities and cognitive limitations, yet alive, breathing, aware. Their existence was both miracle and horror, a testament to endurance and a record of atrocity. And then came the whispered question he dared not voice aloud until it was already inside him. How long could such a system remain hidden? How many more years would the mountains keep such secrets, allowing the line of a family to twist inward until only ruin remained? In the shadows of that clearing, history and horror had intertwined, and Reverend Green was now bound to witness both. What Reverend Green discovered that day would take weeks to fully comprehend. Samuel Whitlock had not simply confined his daughters. He had orchestrated their existence with meticulous precision. Every meal, every birthing, every whispered command had been catalogued in journals that the twins later described to the preacher. Samuel's obsession with purity had driven him to fold the family tree in on itself, generation upon generation, concentrating traits that would have been harmless in a broader population into a living nightmare. The children carried these consequences in their very bodies. Skeletal deformities, cleft palates, shortened limbs, lurching gaits, fused fingers. Some bore cognitive impairments so profound that communication required gestures, expressions, and patient repetition. A girl of 12 had been born with her organs partially outside her body, a medical anomaly so severe that survival seemed impossible. Yet she lived, fragile and aware, like a candle flickering against a relentless wind. Each child was a testament to a bloodline pressed too tightly against itself, a lineage that had become a trap rather than a legacy. As Reverend Green spoke with Rebecca and Rachel, their voices were soft but unwavering. They recounted the endless cycles of pregnancy, the terror of disobedience, the isolation so complete that even the sound of another human voice was a memory. And yet, beneath the horror, there was a strange, resolute love. Despite the circumstances of their conception, the children had become their mother's focus, their reason to survive. Rebecca told Green, her voice steady despite the years of pain, that she hated how her child Wren came to be, but she could never hate that they existed. Rachel's tears fell silently beside her sister, the weight of memory pressing down like the mountain itself. The cabin in the clearing, hidden from the world, had become both prison and sanctuary. The children played within the narrow boundaries of Samuel Whitlock's design, learning from the twins how to navigate a life without freedom. They imitated normalcy as best they could, singing songs, learning routines, and forming attachments that were, in their own way, profoundly human. The woods around them seemed endless, but each tree, each shadow, carried the echo of their father's control. Reverend Green, despite his training and faith, felt unprepared for the magnitude of what he had uncovered. The laws of men offered little recourse in these mountains. Even if he could bring the twins and children back to civilization, how could society reconcile the horror of their origins with the humanity they had somehow preserved? The ethical, moral, and medical implications stretched far beyond the clearing, beyond Appalachia, into the very foundations of human understanding. And yet, the preacher did not falter. He knew the first step was to remove them from the mountains, to bring the twins and their 7 children into the light of a world that had nearly forgotten them. The journey would be slow, agonizing, and fraught with challenges, but it was the only path to survival, the only chance to translate years of hidden suffering into a story the world might finally acknowledge. The journey from the hidden clearing to Harland was grueling. Reverend Green guided Rebecca, Rachel, and the 7 children over trails carved by wind and rock, where even the most experienced mountain men tread lightly. The children, unused to travel beyond the small circle of their father's design, struggled with every step. The 2 youngest, a girl of 5 and a boy of 2, had never walked more than a few hundred yards in their lives. Their small legs wobbled beneath them, their cries echoing through the hollow as they fought against exhaustion and the unfamiliar terrain. The older children fared slightly better, though each movement revealed the lingering effects of isolation and concentrated bloodlines. Margaret, the eldest at 15, moved with surprising steadiness, but even she bore the subtle deformities of generations of inbreeding, twisted toes, a hunched posture, and eyes that carried a haunted comprehension of the unnatural world she had grown within. Sarah, 12, and Elizabeth, 10, both fragile and wise beyond their years, clung to their mothers as they navigated the mossy stones, their bodies betraying the years of repeated pregnancies and the strain of survival. Rebecca and Rachel bore the physical weight of the journey as well, their bodies marked by long years of forced motherhood. Each step was a reminder of what had been taken from them, yet they moved forward with determination, focused on their children's survival. The forest seemed almost to resist their passage, branches clawing at their clothes, roots threatening to twist ankles, and the wind carrying the scent of decay and damp earth. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the call of a distant bird, the rush of cold water over stones, was magnified in the twins' memory, echoing the isolation that had defined 17 years of their lie. Bathies. By the 5th day, the settlement of Harland emerged like a miracle through the fog. The sight of other cabins, smoke rising from chimneys, and the distant laughter of children unfamiliar with the twins' ordeal struck them with both relief and terror. The community, unprepared for the sight of Rebecca and Rachel returning with 7 obviously impaired children, reacted with shock, disbelief, and horror. Old memories of the missing sisters resurfaced in the minds of townsfolk who had searched 17 years prior, now confronted with the tangible consequences of a nightmare that had existed beyond their comprehension. The authorities, led by Sheriff Douglas Pike, took immediate action, first securing the twins and their children, then investigating the hidden cabin and the main Whitlock homestead. There they found the grim evidence of Samuel's years of control, supplies meticulously recorded, journals noting every pregnancy, and the remnants of the isolation that had defined the Whitlock line for decades. Yet Samuel himself was gone, his body decomposed in the cabin he had built for his daughters, leaving behind only the enduring consequences of his obsession. The community faced an ethical and emotional reckoning. How could they care for children born of such horror? How could they reconcile the innocence of the victims with the unnatural circumstances of their existence? And how could the twins, who had survived unspeakable suffering, be allowed to nurture their children in a world that scarcely understood them? The immediate concern fell upon the children. 7 lives born from forced pregnancies, hidden from the world and marked by generations of closed bloodlines. Doctors and clergy alike struggled to make sense of their conditions. Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, a physician from Lexington, examined each child with meticulous attention, documenting skeletal deformities, cognitive impairments, and physical anomalies that spoke of repeated consanguinity. Some children were barely able to speak, others could walk only with difficulty, and one girl had survived against medical odds despite a congenital defect that left her internal organs exposed. The orphanage in Lexington became their first refuge. Margaret, Sarah, and Elizabeth, though physically and mentally limited, began learning basic tasks, reading, and routines under careful supervision. The boys, James and Robert, required constant care, their days structured around meals, hygiene, and simple activities that offered purpose but no true independence. Charlotte, 5, and Thomas, 2, too young to remember much of the forest or the cabin, gradually adjusted to life in a world that was, for them, entirely new. For Rebecca and Rachel, this separation from their children was agonizing. After 17 years of being the only constant presence in their lives, even a few miles of distance became a vast and unbearable gulf. Despite the trauma, the twins exhibited extraordinary resilience. They worked tirelessly with Reverend Green and the orphanage staff, helping to care for the children while navigating their own psychological wounds. They shared the songs and routines they had created in the cabin, providing continuity for their children and teaching small lessons in love and survival that had been their only tools for 17 years. Their experiences, though horrific, had forged a resourcefulness that became essential for the children's adaptation to a world they had never known. The moral and social questions surrounding the Whitlock case were complex. How could society address a situation in which legal boundaries were so blurred, and crimes committed over decades remained unpunished by death or law? Samuel Whitlock had left no possibility for reconciliation, only the visible consequences of his obsession with purity. And yet, the community recognized the humanity of the children. They were victims first, born into a nightmare, and deserving of protection and care. The years following their rescue were marked by observation, medical study, and careful supervision. The orphanage, church authorities, and the few willing townspeople worked to balance the need for healing with the social stigma surrounding the Whitlock name. Each child's development was closely monitored, and the twins' presence remained a vital, if unsettling, influence. They were the only link to a past that was as horrifying as it was instructive, a living bridge between generations of isolation and the fragile hope of survival. In this way, the Whitlock legacy endured, both as a cautionary tale of isolation's cruelty and as a testament to the human capacity for endurance, care, and the preservation of life in the darkest circumstances. By 1886, 3 years after their rescue, Rebecca and Rachel made a decision that unsettled the orphanage staff. They requested to live together in a small house on the orphanage grounds, close to their children, so they could participate in their upbringing. The board debated extensively. Some feared that continued proximity would prevent the twins from healing, while others worried that the children might be emotionally destabilized by the unnatural family structure. But Rebecca and Rachel were insistent. They had survived 17 years of deliberate captivity and forced motherhood. They would not allow well-meaning charity to separate them from the only beings that had given their suffering purpose. The small cottage was austere, but sufficient. The twins moved in with the understanding that they would submit to supervision, attend counseling, and follow strict guidelines in their interactions with the children. Even within these constraints, the dynamic was fragile, shaped by trauma, resilience, and necessity. Margaret, the eldest, embraced the presence of her mothers with quiet relief, her maturity and intelligence allowing her to mediate between the twins and her younger siblings. Sarah, delicate and burdened with a seizure disorder, clung to familiar routines, while Elizabeth, fragile yet emotionally acute, became the quiet anchor for her youngest siblings. James and Robert, the boys, found security in the repetition and predictability of the orphanage, but their cognitive limitations left them partially bewildered by the unconventional arrangements. Charlotte and Thomas, young enough to adapt fully, perceived the cottage as part of the larger world of care that had replaced the cabin's isolation. The twins' presence became a stabilizing force, a paradoxical mixture of comfort and a reminder of the horrors that had defined the first 17 years of the children's lives. As the years unfolded, the children began to diverge in ability and independence. Margaret, persistent and resilient despite her cleft palate, eventually left the orphanage to work as a seamstress in Lexington. She visited her mothers and siblings regularly, maintaining a quiet dignity despite the scars, both physical and psychological, that marked her lineage. Sarah, whose seizures worsened, required lifelong care in a sanitarium, while Elizabeth survived against medical expectation in a church-operated home for invalids, offering her limited strength to younger, disabled children. James and Robert remained within institutional care, performing simple work within their abilities, their lives circumscribed by the lingering consequences of the Whitlock line. Charlotte adapted more fully, entering adulthood within the orphanage environment, while Thomas, the youngest, required constant supervision. Each child's trajectory reflected the compounded effects of isolation, inbreeding, and circumstance, yet all bore the imprint of love, however complicated, from the two women who had survived unspeakable oppression to nurture what little light remained. Through it all, Rebecca and Rachel remained intertwined in each other's lives, bound not only by twinship, but by the shared burden of survival, motherhood, and the responsibility of guiding children whose origins were as horrific as they were real. Their existence and the lives of their children became a living testament to endurance, the thin margin between cruelty and care, and the human capacity to transform even the darkest circumstances into acts of compassion. As decades passed, the Whitlock children grew into the fragile light of the world outside the cabin. Each carried marks, some visible, some invisible, of the 17 years spent under Samuel W. Whitlock's obsessive control, yet they survived. Margaret, Sarah, Elizabeth, James, Robert, Charlotte, and Thomas each found their place within the limits that fate and biology allowed. The orphanage, the church, and a few sympathetic townsfolk became stewards of their lives, guardians of a history that the mountains had once hidden so completely. Rebecca and Rachel, ever inseparable, watched their children mature in ways that were both joyous and sorrowful. The cottage became a place of rituals, small celebrations, and quiet mourning. They mourned the innocence lost, the years stolen by a father whose obsession had warped bloodlines, and the dreams of freedom that could never be fully realized. Yet they celebrated life wherever it emerged. Elizabeth's stubborn survival against frailty, Margaret's careful independence, the simple joy of Charlotte's laughter, and Thomas's gentle presence. In the spring of 1926, Rebecca passed quietly, her body finally yielding to the slow decline of age. Rachel followed just 8 months later, her death attributed to a quiet surrender, as if the other half of her soul had left with her twin. They were buried side by side in the orphanage cemetery, their shared headstone reading simply, Rebecca and Rachel Whitlock, sisters, mothers, survivors. The mountains that had once imprisoned them and their children now held only memory. The cabins collapsing into earth, reclaimed by time, leaves, and roots. The story of the Whitlock family faded from public discourse. Newspapers yellowed, medical lectures moved on, and the children's names became part of anonymized records, referenced in studies of genetics, inbreeding, and the compounding consequences of isolation. Yet in Appalachian folklore, the tale lingered, a warning whispered among families who had long practiced cousin marriage, a reminder that isolation could shape not just lives, but bloodlines. The mountains kept the secret, even as knowledge grew, and the consequences of closed communities became understood through science and observation. By the 21st century, genealogical research occasionally unearthed distant Whitlock descendants. Some carried traces of the concentrated bloodline, now diluted through generations of outcrossing. Yet some recessive traits appeared unexpectedly, hinting at the shadows of a lineage born of isolation and obsession. The cabins themselves had vanished, the land healed, yet the echoes remained, a story of cruelty transformed into endurance. The Whitlock case endures as a testament to the darkest possibilities of isolation, the dangers of obsession, and the resilience of those who survive it. Samuel Whitlock's nightmare lasted 17 years, shaping multiple generations. Yet Rebecca and Rachel, bound by trauma and love, transformed that nightmare, refusing to let their children exist as symbols of violation alone. They insisted upon recognition of their humanity, 7 children, born of horror, raised in captivity, yet loved despite it all. A mother's love, even when the circumstances of life are unspeakable, endures. Rebecca's words to Reverend Green echo through time, haunting and beautiful. I hate how they came to be, but I could never hate that they exist. The story of the Whitlocks is one of survival, of twisted legacies, and of love that persists even in the shadow of unimaginable darkness.